This episode of the podcast is being sponsored by my friends over at Real Mushrooms, realmushrooms.com, my friends Jeff and Sky Chilton. I had Jeff on the podcast. He's a really fascinating guy. I was really happy when they offered to be a sponsor. They sell medicinal mushrooms, things like reishi, chaga, cordyceps, turkey tail. I think many people are now familiar with the amazing medicinal qualities of mushrooms. They sell an amazing product. It's 100% organic. It's the actual mushroom, which is unlike a lot of companies that are either not organic, they don't actually use the mushroom, they can have fillers, they're potentially using the mycelium on grain, and that's in the final product. So really high quality product. It's the only product I use. I think they're just doing amazing work. As listeners of the podcast, you can receive 25% off of your first order if you use the discount code UNIVERSE at checkout, and I think you'll be really, really happy with their products. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Natasja Pelgrom. Natasja is a very interesting woman. We came into contact with each other recently. We sat down and spoke about her background. Specifically, at 14 years old, she had a very revelatory experience with mushrooms in her native Amsterdam. And I think that really changed the trajectory of her life. It started her on a kind of quote-unquote spiritual journey. She tried a lot of different practices, eventually landing in this space of psychedelics, plant medicine. We talked about her background, about her work, different philosophies. She has, I think, a really beautiful quality to her, and really, I think, shares from a place of a deep experiential wisdom. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think and trust you all will gain a lot of this episode. If you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Marav Artsy, we have a number of retreats coming up. We just recently added a teacher training, June, July, in Portugal. We're going to be in Ireland and Peru doing a couple remote dietas. So if you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org, as well as my work with integration calls, consultation calls, different remote work. And then, as always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help. If you're able to join Patreon, that's always super, super amazing. It's a platform you can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers that you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, thank you very much to the people supporting that way. It really means a lot. And if you're able to, thank you in advance. And then if not, as always, supporting with the algorithms is really helpful. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the videos. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So I think that's it for the intro. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Natasja.
Running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. From the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, Natasja, thank you very much for coming on. We were chatting a little before we started. But you have a really interesting story. I was reading a bit about your bio. I listened to a couple interviews that you did. I know this is always a huge question to start, but I would imagine some of the audience has heard of you. I'm sure some haven't. So just to give the audience a bit of a background about who you are, what you do, and again, I know it's a big question, but just the journey that life has taken you to get you to the point you're at.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Jason. It's really lovely. And I just want to honor that we are both on European soil, and you're part on the soil that is my fatherline in Portugal. And I'm right now on the soil in the Netherlands, which is my motherline. So I feel right at home between the two. Just want to acknowledge the lands that we are on here today. And my story. Wow, I never know where to begin, and I always try to, in each podcast interview, to say something that I haven't said before. So let me see where we're going to go with this. But I do always want to honor the very beginning of where I am today, which is the very cheeky, courageous 14-year-old girl who had a lot of questions about life, about intuition, about curiosity. Why do people do what they do? What is trauma? Why do we become what we become? What is intuition? And my very first experience with psychedelic experience was in the Netherlands with mushrooms. And these allies at the time were in 1994, were legal. So now there's a different kind of legal structure in the Netherlands. And although that was not an intentional ceremonial depth work with all of the harm reduction and all of the things that we're speaking into nowadays, it was definitely one of the most meaningful experiences because to me, in the moment, I didn't realize it, but many, many years later, it was quite an initiation and it catapulted me on the path that I am today. I started studying all of these different contemplative practices, philosophy, psychology, body, and energy work, new age for a very long time. I went to that path, neo-shamanism. I was just like trying to eat it all up and understand our human experience and our psyche and our longing to be in expanded state. So I always want to credit where credit is due, where, our beautiful fungi allies and his, courageous 14-year-old who took mushrooms and ended up in this massive spiritual awakening from that moment onwards, which set a lot of seeds in the years to come, which literally for about 20 years, I hadn't realized that was the starting point. That was the initial point. And it almost felt like a contract came into completion because that needed to be starting at that moment for me to be where I am today. So for the last 13 years, I've been dedicating my path to really human flourishing, and that is transformation in the broadest sense, with and without allies, with different practices. And in 2017, I launched my above ground retreat methodology and also collaborated with other platforms in creating well-rounded experiences for people to heal, transform, and get to know themselves and learn. So last 13 years have been really my main focus. But leading up, I have a background in entrepreneurial background in fashion and events, photography. So, I've had multiple businesses, and my passion is really to be able to find a bridge between commonality, to find ways to transmute polarity, to find ways to bridge neuroscience and ancient wisdom, to find ways where we have our human experience, our transcendence, our, the things that make us alike, our universality. So that is to me very much still from the 14-year-old till the 46-year-old, still very much my quest in that. So yeah, now today, besides having had about, I stopped counting to be very honest, but probably over 1,500 ceremonies in that sense, with 5-MeO DMT and psilocybin truffles, which is, legal in the Netherlands. And now I am really focused on providing supervision and supporting leading facilitators and practitioners who want to deepen their work in their own practices, but also those who want to build a relationship with our allies in a way that is embodied and slow and takes time and off the interwebs. So not training through just theory, but really through actual personal experience. So that's where I am today.
I think we must be the same age, and maybe a similar story. You were a few years ahead of me, but I was actually studying in France when I was 20, and I went to Amsterdam for a school trip or some break or something, and did the maybe typical thing that young people do, and consumed large doses of cannabis and mushrooms, thinking that I was somehow, invincible or it wouldn't really affect me. But it very much did. And it's interesting because it's not something I often think about, because I think my life went in many different directions since then. But kind of tracing it back, that was the first big experience I had. And it was actually very, very scary, very beautiful, very, very awe-inspiring. It's interesting because you use this word curiosity, and it was something that I was reflecting upon, because also in my biography, that it's always kind of strange what you say about yourself. But I think in my biography in the beginning, it's something like that I've always had a deep curiosity of life. But then I was also wondering, I mean, doesn't everyone have that? But maybe they don't, because it is something that even in my own life, I mean, it's been very varied, and I have done a lot of things, and just it's been maybe a bit eccentric from many people's life. But do you think that was just something that you were innately born with? I mean, how the stars were arranged, your DNA, your epigenetics, or do you think that's something that was imparted on you? Is that something you've ever reflected upon, of like where that curiosity came from?
100%. I'm probably, having metacognition. So reflection is very, very big part since a very young age. I mean, I have memories from the age of 1 to 4 to every age, so I that curiosity, I believe 100% that, of course, there is an environment that stimulates it. I think there is a character. I think it's a combination of multiple things. However, I do believe it's also very strongly innately in my DNA. In that sense, my Dutch background is an artist background. They were very much in the Second World War, very prominent people in the protection of children and Jews in the Netherlands. And it was a very, very big endeavor where that whole family stepped into. And as artists, writers, theater makers, photographers, and I think any form of art expression has an innate curiosity and a hunger to understand. So and then my Portuguese background, they're farmers, farmers as in wine. But they actually were immigrants in Paris. So my father and my grandparents, they moved to Paris when he was 13 to avoid going into military in Africa, Mozambique, and Angola. Because your first born son at the age of 18, unless you were more than 5 years abroad. So my grandparents. So for a very tiny village of farming and very conventional and valued people to go, it's, for us today, it's like, yeah, we'll just go to Paris. But at that time, that you need to have quite some gusto and balls to be able to do that. So there's another way of, and both my parents are always very much out of the norm. And so I grew up with an environment that really invites you to ask questions. It's like those who walk the edges of our society are 9 out of 10 times the most exciting people, because they dare. They are different. They are the way showers, the misfits. And I believe that's my heart is as much as that as I am sitting here, being a facilitator and all of that. But I am as much as a crazy pirate at the same time, It's so both cultivate, I think, culturally, and I think what has been cultivated inside of me, and the hunger to be actually walking the edge, for many different reasons, not just curiosity, but also to go against the status quo. This rebellion that is inside, and in our teenage years, it comes out a little bit more, and now we serve with plant medicines.
You use that word edge, which is quite interesting. I mean, in many cultures or traditions around the world, they often speak of people who do this work as somehow walking this edge or having a foot in both worlds. And It's interesting because on the one hand, even that idea of working with plants, that there's something very natural about it. I mean, in the very literal meaning of that word, you're working with nature, with plants or spirits of plants, and yet at the same time, you're working with people. And so in a way, you do need to be connected to both nature and people, the human psyche. You also said, interestingly, like even at 14 or at a young age, you were interested in things like trauma. I mean, was that part of your curiosity of just the nature of people? Like, who are people? What are they thinking? What's the nature of their problems? What differentiates people? And because I think that is, like, I think we sometimes lose things in names and labels, and we say something like psychology or psychiatry as if it's something very specialized, which it is, but it's also just a very basic curiosity of what is a human being, how does the mind work. Do you think that was part of that curiosity? Was kind of the nature of humans? Who am I? What is the nature of us?
Yes, and to also refer to what you just named about our relationship with our natural relationship to plant allies and fungi and everything that is in between. I believe there is this almost like an innate calling or understanding that and longing, I think it's the word longing even more, to connect. We are relational beings, right? And just because our brain has GABA, which prevents us to see all the realms, and once that is taken away, we can see, wow, the fluidity of everything that is happening. There is still like this light, this thing that pulls us towards that. So I believe, and I feel very fortunate to be in contact with many people that have this. So in my world, it's a lot of people that have this, but I know that the world at large is not like that. And then to answer your question around the curiosity around trauma, and yes, I mean, we have so many buzzwords right now that come from psychology to explain things and be diagnostic about it instead of saying like, you know what, this is just our human conditioning. It's part of it in a way. But yeah, I definitely, because I also grew up with observing addiction with different family members, different forms of addiction, and seeing as a young child what that would do. It always made me, I never had judgment or I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to understand why. Why do we do that? Why is in one family constellation, let's say two brothers, just as an example, they have exactly the same upbringing, exactly the same experience, and one goes into that direction, the other one goes into that direction. Either, has a flourishing career and the other one has an addiction, for example, just to give a contrast, a random contrast. So those kind of things, observing at a very young age was like, why do we do, how and why, and what does that mean? So, and very quickly, I could really see through support that I had received at a very young age with parents that were divorced and growing up in different nationalities in 3 different countries, 3 different languages, 3 different schools, 3 different friend groups until the age of 10 already. By the time I was 11 and I was back in the Netherlands and learning the Dutch language, I got some psychological support for those transitions, and the things that I was observing there made me curious. Oh, these are part of the human psyche. Oh, these are patterns. Oh, and so that, I think that is also little seeds that happen that you're exposed to from a very young environment to explore trauma in that sense. And to also, I think, and this is more of a bigger longing that I've been really looking into and curious about, is our human condition about purpose and meaning. are longing to have purpose and meaning. And the disconnect in what we see in the world when it comes to those who are diagnosed with depression or anxiety, one of the core factors is, the disconnect that is actually present in those states. And that disconnect relates back to, meaning, meaning to get up, meaning to, have nourishing food, to make ourselves a priority, to be healthy, like all of those parts beyond the meaning of life. So, and that is still here. That did not change. The purpose and meaning quest is always somewhere like a North Star, evolving and understanding and looking at philosophers and psychology and the different traditions, how they relate to that, and different people's experiences when they come in with questions around it, and how things get answered for them or not, and what does that mean? So yes, it's like a kid in a candy store, like, ooh, give me more.
Yeah. I think that idea of longing, it's such a beautiful concept. And yet again, it seems like something that certain people maybe embody more. I mean, even in Portugal, they kind of joke that the Portuguese have this longing. It's where the fado music comes from, this longing. Yeah. But it's interesting because even I spent many years in the Amazon, and even with a lot of the peoples of the Amazon, they like we often think that like we live in these very difficult times and things are worse than they've ever been, and yet even in these very ancient cultures they speak of this idea that humans have this longing, they have this suffering that's innate in the human condition, the human being, and that these plants were actually gifts of, interestingly, star beings. That may sound a little bit out there, but to help us to remember.
With me, get more out there, the better. Yes.
Do you find that to be a core aspect of your work? Is that you find a lot of this work is helping people to somehow satiate or to reconnect, to get in touch with that longing, that there is something deep inside everyone that this work is beginning to point towards?
Yes, for a very long time, it almost felt like my path in here and my bigger why, was because of let's heal the world, right? So I've worked with a lot of people in different diagnoses and different addictions until I also came to the realization that at some point something shifted for me personally, where my work at the moment and the intentionality in my why has dropped a lot more into our shared humanity. And the absolute beauty of duality. Duality as it being the gift instead of transcending it, and the idea of enlightenment that a lot of the times is, and if we come into a kind of a surrender about the ick of our human experience, our shadow, our imbalances, our ability to love so deeply, and ability to fear so deeply, and the ability to hate so deeply, all of those aspects that makes us aware of ourselves, right? It's the ultimate devotion to God. And that is more my personal why at the moment than necessarily let's heal the world. Great that there is an end result, that there is a psychological, somatic effect for someone's well-being. That is amazing. But what I'm holding as a bigger container is this real deep surrender to our shared humanity, which is, to me, the gift. And And in that, there are many, I call it like many different branches that go out, where I've seen over the years how many people in spiritual practices and contemplative practices, with allies, with star beings, all of that, really give away their discernment and give away their sovereignty, as if that is more benevolent than your inner knowing. And I feel like this, almost like this very protective of, no, you have the discernment, you have the birthright, you have the intuition, you're an equal in relationship to all of that. There is no, and yes, we can go metaphysically deeper on the different layers of consciousness and where we are, and the spiral of the wisdom that we gather over many lifetimes, but still there is an equality. It's just a different perspective. It's like, if I go to Japan, I would need a translator. Doesn't mean that the translator and the person that I'm speaking with there is less or more than I am, just because I'm speaking another human dialect, right? So, and it's the same thing in any metaphysical spaces. To me, it's like, okay, let's work with the translator, right? It doesn't make me or my discernment. And this is what I've seen so many times, that so quickly assumptions are being made. So quickly people change their actions instead of sitting and slowing down as being the antidote to cultivate a regulated nervous system as the base, of our wisdom. A regulated and understanding of how do I ask open-ended, smart questions to myself and in the metaphysical. Right? If you're in a journey where you receive, you can call it a download, an insight, a vision, a guide who shares something, why aren't you, majority of people, not questioning that first and sitting with it? If someone walks past me in the street and makes a comment about what I should do, or am I going to do it? You're going to go like, oh, that's a crazy person. Who the hell are you? Right? But in those rounds, we're suddenly, oh, that was a benevolent, was it? Wasn't that maybe a metaphorical expression of your ego and your longing? Why? Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. And that takes time. So that human duality, that human connectiveness, and then paired with the sovereign right and discernment, and cultivating that instead of giving it away so quickly. Those are passions that live within me very strongly at the moment that we are recording this. Might be very different in a year's time if we speak again. I'm allowed to change. But that's where I'm at right now for sure.
You use this word relational, which I think is very interesting, and I even when I started doing this work, and as one of my teachers was describing to me, the kind of the pillars of the house that we're working on are all these relational aspects. And at the time, it seemed very kind of mundane, or like it just seems very normal. But he described these four relational aspects: the relationship that we have to our family, our friends, our loved ones. Also this idea of work and money, which seemed, especially in many like spiritual circles, seemed somehow not relevant to this work. And the fourth one he called acquaintances, which are just people who don't necessarily fall in any of those four categories, but that in essence, if any of those are not in a relational aspect, a balanced, a whole, a healed relational aspect, then we suffer. The pillars of the house are not solid. Over the years, I think I've come to understand that better. And much as you said, like life is a relational aspect. Even if we look at this idea of God or spirit as oneness, even I think very beautifully in the Tao Te Ching, they speak of this idea like the Tao gave birth to the one gave birth to the two gave birth to the three gave birth to the 10,000 things. But we even speak of this world as a world of duality. Like there's Natasja and there's Jason, and that's how we're having this conversation, is because there's something to be reflected. There's a relational aspect. Everything in the world that we've created is there's some relation. There's me and there's not me. There's everything else, and I exist in that world through that relation. I think that's a point that's very often overlooked in this work, and yet it's so foundational. You know, as you said, there can be things that people are looking for, which are certainly possibilities and realities often, but that this aspect of these very real, these very relational aspects are, in a way, very fundamental, very very much these pillars. Can you speak more about that? Because I think that's a topic that's very often overlooked, and yet it's very very vital.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would love to give actually two contrast examples of, let's call it two case studies, right? I do supervision for a lot of facilitators, and because I have a very strong entrepreneurial, logic, strategic brain, and then a very devotional aspect embedded in both in me, you know, where it's liminal, where it's connecting to the sublime. And when I say the sublime, I'm referring to Immanuel Kant, who is the philosopher who really spoke about our human need to connect to the sublime, to the wonder and mystery and beauty of life, right? Which explains a lot of the times, a lot of what traditional or spiritual traditions are speaking into. And in those supervision sessions and what I see, so for example, one is someone that has a very strong foundation in counseling and therapeutic context or coaching context, and has really an underdeveloped relationship to the sublime, to the plant kingdom and queendom, to the fungi, if that's what they want to work with. And it's almost like a kind of blind spot, interesting enough. It's not because people are wrong or not good intentional. It's almost like the relational is missing there with the unseen. So my question a lot of the times is, what is your relationship then to this medicine, sacrament, compound, however, psychedelic, however people want to, you know, one of the words someone chooses that they prefer working with? What is your relationship? How do you connect with it on a daily basis instead of being a commodity, right? And this is where a lot of the understanding and also quite some fear, interesting enough, around how to work with ritual. What does ritual even mean? Am I not appropriating? Oh, who am I to now do this? Instead of making things your own, a repetition in an action is a ritual. It doesn't have to be related to a specific tradition, right? But it's about having the respect and literally the relationship. And this is when I also explain to people and mentees and people that I supervise, it's almost like the relationship you build. So if I, cultivate a friendship with Jason, right, over the years, I call him up. When I think of him, I say like, oh, I just had a thought about you. How are you? You just popped in my head. Hey, Jason, we haven't spoken for 3 months, but you know what? I saw your picture and it made me laugh. You want to go and grab a coffee, you cultivate.
That's pretty common, by the way. When people see a photo of me, they laugh.
I should look at your photos more often then. You build that relationship, you cultivate that. It takes two to tango, you cultivate that relationship and you take the time for it. So it has meaning, there is a friendship. Now let's call in, for example, Maria. Maria, I know really well. And I said, you know what? Jason is awesome. Every time I see his picture, I just want to have coffee with him. You should meet Jason. By the fact that I'm introducing Maria to Jason, Jason is already liking Maria a lot more because Jason and I build a friendship. And that's the same with the unseen. if I have, a relationship, a devotion, a language, an honoring, a respect, a discernment, a willingness to look at my truths, which are, the unconscious, the conscious, the shadow, willingness to work, willingness to evolve, willingness to serve, willingness to go through many ego deaths, willingness to be in humility. All of that builds the relationship with the unseen. And in that relationship, when now Maria comes in to meet the unseen, she comes in through the merit of my relationship. And that's the same thing if I would go to and have an experience or a dieta with Jason and his team or his group or, in his retreat, and that I am coming in on the depth of the knowledge that he's received from his teachers, from the allies, and from his own inner work. So I'm coming in through a gate that is a privilege because that's the dedication that Jason created, and now I'm able to step into. And this is such an important understanding where the aspect, and this is one of my favorite words, devotion comes in beyond the institutional aspect. Beyond the religious aspect of the word devotion. But really that devotion, and next to devotion needs to be commitment. Those two need to, it's almost like a marriage, What am I committed to? Not necessarily what is my intention. Intention and expectations can be quite vague. No, what am I committed doing in that relationship? So that's a case A. Case B would be someone that is very well trained in traditional sense, who has a very deep relationship with the unseen, who has an understanding about the cosmology and the different realms and how to navigate energetics and how to understand that, it starts with the ritual of stepping out of the mundane and creating that kind of container and setting and sacred circle and working with fire and working with the elements. That person has a very strong relationship with that, but then lacks a complete blind spot and relationship to the aspect that the moment you're going to serve more than one person, you're in a different container and you're stepping into a business. And that business of enrollment, boundaries, assessment, preparation calls, your website, payment terms, all of that is relational as the same way as it's devotional way. So it's really interesting that people see relational only through a specific lens, but relational is through all the lenses. Because the structure of what you're doing creates the safety, the protection, energetically and in the mundane rational, psychologically and metaphysically and physically, So a lot of the times there is a misconception that structure will be against intuition or the devotion. But the structure is actually the containment of the yang where the yin can freely navigate, right? So it's a matter of reframing what is relational and where am I lacking of relational, and do I maybe need to work on my limiting beliefs? Do I need to understand my upbringing? Do I need to understand maybe the intergenerational trauma that took place that prevents me to be with everything in a relational space? And that one isn't better than the other at all. And this is why, referring back to our shared humanity and our human experiences and this deeper passion, that a lot of the times the mundane is bypassed or pushed aside, which we're actually, once we integrate the mundane in the sacred, this is where there is a wholeness that takes place within our human experience. So yeah, that's a great question. I could give these examples.
You use quite a few times this word unseen. Could you elaborate a bit on that? I think many people would have an idea of what you're speaking about. And then I think to some people, that's also quite a foreign concept. And yet also, I think even if someone doesn't have an idea, that depending on who's speaking, that can mean many different things as well.
Yeah, with the unseen, I personally name like a wider lens, not just specific, but let's say the unseen being the relationship you have to your, let's say, your ancestors, plant allies, spirit, the angelic realm, your navigating expanded states of consciousness, the access you have through breath work or psychedelic experiences, and all of these different layers, anything that is beyond our 3D vision in that realm. So for me, it's like an umbrella term where a lot of things fall under in that sense. So the unseen being a relationship with the one thing you might not be able to grab in the 3D, but is very present in your life.
And do you find that plants, psychedelics, fungi, are that's one of their primary uses, is to get us in touch with that unseen?
That's a good question. And I'll be really honest, I don't know. I don't, I sometimes think that we have very limited ways of seeing into the bigger cosmic order and how and why and what. Is that there a way of purpose? Maybe, maybe. Is there a supreme intelligence? Yes, to me there is. Is there also a discernment and a sovereignty in these allies and choice and maybe preference and maybe parts of what we would see from our human experience, egoic structures, preferences, talents, as any other human would have? Yeah. Of course they give access to that unseen. Yes. But is that part of their purpose? I don't know. Maybe we're their food. Maybe we have got it all wrong. And this is the thing. After my first experience at 14, I thought I knew a lot. At 46, I don't think I know enough at all. If I would start today with serving, I don't even think I would start, to be really honest, with the things that I know today. Not because out of fear, but because knowing makes you understand how much you don't know in a way. It's interesting what the paradox brings up when you're moving through these realms and these relationships with these allies. They, let me just use a funny way. They humble the shit out of you, So it's like, yeah, I don't know, I really don't. How I do want to name something that I think will be interesting for your audience beyond the plant allies and mushrooms and psychedelics and everything that's involved. One of my current teachers is darkness. And that's sitting for multiple days in complete darkness. There is no music, there is no talk, there is nothing. And what happens to the human, the psyche, the lack of light, what happens to when you've already worked with different allies that are in your system and your awareness has already expanded in many different ways and the access you then have. My biggest passion at the moment is to sit with absolutely nothing. And literally be in a state where the internal medicine is rising and trusting that relationship is a very different experience. So I know I'm diverting from your question, but I wanted to name that because there is, to me, a very big aha moment when I stepped into multiple day darkness of this bodily knowing and understanding of this has been with us for eons. This is beyond the biohacking sphere or, the expansion or let me gather more. No, it's actually a very natural human state to go into. The same thing what you would experience in a vision quest, or indeed, coming into an expanded state that you feel like, wow, this is more true than, when I'm not in this state. So darkness has been my medicine more than anything I've ever anticipated. Especially in an age where we're conditioned to be psychonauts and do more, gain more, expand more, enlighten more, in that way.
It's interesting you use the word knowing, because that seems to be at the root of many spiritual traditions, and it's also this interesting paradox, because usually knowing is something that in most of our cultures we seek from the outside, like you go to university, or you find a teacher, or you read a book or something. But it seems what you're referring to is something that can arise from within, which is interesting. I mean, like, even I always find it very fascinating. I spent a long time working with a group of people called the Shipibo Kanibo people, and they become quite well known for their work with ayahuasca, and yet in their language, because ayahuasca is a Quechua word, in Shipibo they call it uni, and uni, it's usually translated as some idea of knowledge. What do you think is that? And this is a huge question, but what do you think is that differentiation between, like, knowledge that's learned in a book or from a teacher or passed down versus something that you seem to be pointing to, which is something that can arise from a disconnect, a going inward? Because I think even in a lot of these traditions, like, they very much value that over an external knowledge. I mean, these usually aren't traditions of words or lessons being taught to you, but pointing back to this internal knowing, and that when that arises, then it doesn't need to be proven, or, well, he said that or she said that. It is what it is.
Yeah. That is indeed a very big question. Let me just go into the simplification of something, because I think maybe it's nice to hear a perspective. I'm not saying I'm having an ultimate perspective, but a perspective. A lot of the times there is a bit of confusion about knowing, intuition, and how do I know? How do I know? First of all, if you're asking the question, that's not knowing. That's not knowing. There is a relational, there is a mental process that is taking place, right? Then you have intuition. Intuition is most of the time very simple. It's a simple, can either arise with some people as a physical impulse or physical expression first. A sensation for people that are, attuned to their bodies, who might have years of yogic practice. And there might have more sensory awareness of their body, right? They might start in their body, but intuition, it's also a lot more silent. It's simple. It's one word. Moment there is also like a different pace to it. So the moment there is ego masked as intuition, there is a storyline, an identity attached to it, like sometimes even a preference, and it goes a lot slower. The mind is actually quite slow in its thinking. So it's really interesting because, if you start to observe, intuition is very direct and quick. Even in communication with some allies, it's very direct communication. That's not the mind. There's like a distinction in it, right? There's a flavor of a difference. And it takes time to sit and practice and observe. This is why the word metacognition, to become an observer of the thought and recognize patterns. And this is why meditation is so helpful also when you are cooperating with plant kingdom and queendom in this sense, right? Is that it will help you to discern the egoic storytelling and the intuitive that is coming in. So, those are two structures that I have mapped out for myself. Now, the inner knowing, it's almost like it's intuitive, it is mental, and there is just no doubt about it, where all of it comes together as one with a third element to it. So instead of seeing it as when the intuition and the ratio come together, being the Vesca Pisces, that's how I'm seeing right now, like coming together, there will be, for example, a full component of a fullness to the inner knowing. And that feels grand, grounded, and clear. It feels all encompassing. And there will be a flavor into it that it's something that is for you alone. It's the same thing when you've gone through what Jason was referring to. There is this, maybe practice or quest or dieta or anything, even life circumstances, even if it's not intentionality. There is an aha moment that arises from within. There is this inner knowing. And sometimes it feels like an initiation that arises from within. And once that happens, you will know so clearly that it's something that is so personal that you wouldn't even want to share it with anyone. And that's where there is a true humility around it, in it. So those are I call it my flavors of mapping out what is my ego, what is my story, what is my identity, where's my preference, what is intuition on a day-to-day basis, and what is this grander inner knowing that occurs after deep devotional work or practice or diet or maybe even death or grief or things that catapult you in the next stage of your own human evolution. I've had moments where I, was in real deep sadness and grief and heartbreak and sitting in the shower in the dark and, and having this overwhelming expansion of knowing an aha moment. That wasn't intentional. I wasn't doing any psychedelics. I wasn't in with any teacher. It was a natural occurrence of transformation that happens. And I've had those moments, which, beginning of the year, January 2026, after 7 days of darkness and some very challenging experience in it, there was a really deep inner knowing that arose, which I don't speak about, I name it like this, but I, don't speak about the detail. It's like an emergence that happens. And from that moment onwards, there is a very clear different choices that happen. So your behavior naturally changes towards something different. If your behavior stays the same, if your relationship to certain challenges, wounding, or judgments stays the same, I believe it is more of a maybe egoic, metaphorical, psychological brain occurrence, maybe through catharsism, which happens a lot in the field right now. People are pushed into the catharsism instead of it naturally birthing. Like the woman giving birth, if she starts to push way too early, she risks death of her own and her child. And a lot of these practices that are too early in catharsism, they have an experience, but it doesn't mean there is an inner emerging or an inner knowing that emerges, which then goes into behavioral and systems change, right? So it's like, yes, you can have all of that, but the proof is going to be 6 months ahead, what behaviors have changed? What is your kind of relationship to maybe things of imbalance or limiting beliefs or all of that? which makes the proof. Mm-hmm. I
Yeah,
hope this explains it, by the way.
that's beautifully put. Yeah, thank you. Going back, you were speaking about ritual, and I think many people are drawn to that ritual. I mean, I think you can even just see it in things like yoga. I mean, there's a ritual to that. You put your special clothes on, you get your mat. There's something we may not even think about it, but something sacred in that. It's like a special mat, a mat for your practice. You go to a place. There's a teacher. There's a practice. There may be things you chant, certain changes of consciousness that you feel, a closing of it, maybe some closing of the process. I don't know, a hug or a thank you or something. But in many of these traditions, I mean, usually that's something that we kind of correlate is this idea of ritual or ceremony, and usually with these plants, for example, there was I think a 15th century or Swiss physician named Paracelsus who became quite well known even today, often considered one of the founders of Western medicine. And he has this quote, which is very beautiful, which is that the difference between a medicine and poison is in the dose. And I think there's already something that's being pointed there to a context, a relational aspect of how we look at something, because the same substance can be poison or medicine, but it's how we approach it. Even that, I think, is maybe a bit more of this rational way of looking at something that also just kind of quantifying it down to a certain amount. But maybe in a broader, more holistic sense, it could be seen that also the ritual changes the medicine. It's often seen, even traditionally, that these plants, like every plant had a song, it had a dance, it had a story. And it's often seen that when we lose those, we lose the true medicine. Like the substance can still have an effect, but of course it will. That there's still alkaloids in it, but that there's certain keys that can be unlocked, that can potentially only be unlocked through that ritual, that story, the song, the dance. And certainly, even as these practices maybe morph and change into, for lack of better words, a more Western worldview and potentially a clinical setting. I mean, there's even something, there's a ritual to that. A man or woman coming in a white lab coat in a certain setting and using certain instruments. And there's something that can even give people a great comfort in that. But can you expand a bit more about that idea of ritual? Because it's certainly something that some people value. And at the same time, it's something that we may be also moving away from, and that potentially there can be a lot lost when we lose the story, when we lose the ritual, like things that maybe we don't even understand. Because you also mentioned this idea of the unseen, that maybe even we can understand because maybe we just simply don't have the tools or the worldview, the cosmovision to understand things from a different perspective. But maybe kind of a long question, but why is that ritual important?
So many ways I could go with this. I'm going to choose to go through first a very short explanation that exactly what you shared about rituals come in many different shapes and forms. We brush our teeth twice a day. At least I hope everybody does it twice a day. That's a ritual, but can you be with intentionality into it? Are you fully present when you're doing it, which makes it, of course, the act of ritual starts with presence, right? It is, there is actually quite some research around what ritual does to our brain and the difference they've man, it's out of my personal brain right now, but there was a research around ritual, around grief, where they had a group work with a random ritual nothing traditional, but of writing things down and having the repetition of it, and a group not doing anything, and a group who were dealing with grief, who had the ritual of repetition of writing and doing and, holding a stone. And it was quite some random things, but it was the repetition that made it that they could really map out the difference in how they were in kind of a state of acceptance with their grief, and those that weren't doing it. So there is quite some research, interesting enough, what is doing neurologically, psychologically, and physically to our bodies, which always fascinates me to bridge it. But where I really want to go with this question around ritual is rites of passage. In particular, because that's the type of ritual that conducts a very intentional and important transition in someone's life. And this is what I believe we really miss in our Western society, is the acknowledgement of rites of passage. An initiation transforms a person from the current state into a new one. And even when we shift jobs, when we move houses, it's one thing after another. And having increments or cycles where we cycle of rest, a cycle of preparation, a cycle of celebration when the harvest comes, all of these different cycles that are traditional, we've lost our cyclical nature. And rites of passage have this multi-layered meaning because the purpose and intent of the ritual can be social, psychological, spiritual, religious, and it represents really a way to transform the circumstances or initiate it. And there are, let's say, 3 stages within a rites of passage. There is a separation, a transition, and a reincorporation. And that's almost the anatomy of ritual. And I wanted to speak about this rites of passage because that is also the way where we go into kind of a relationship with the liminality, right? Each initiation ritual in these 3 stages has this preliminal, liminal, and post-liminal. And a lot of the times in the preliminal is the preparation, then the liminal. So for example, I will use myself as an example, as being in darkness, right? There is a preparation for the darkness. There is the actual darkness experience, and then there is the reintegration. The component that misses a lot of the times within this aspect is the reintegration into society, which is community. And the purpose around this specific, rituals in this sense, and especially in transitions or initiations, is to come into, again, the word where we're speaking into relationship to what we are serving in our community. For men and women, these would be different kinds of setup, but it would be, for example, to build a different relationship with our ego, to actually not have the, let's say, the hunger, the craving wolf of our ego to have it loose, but to have it actually know when it has a purpose and know when it needs to be tamed. And, rites of passages create that relationship with our ego, which of course in so many research, the default mode network, how it impacts our ego, our identity, our self-awareness. So I believe that the rise of these expanded states through these kind of allies and plant teachers, the rise of it is, I feel that it's coherent with the lack of structured society rites of passage. We don't have a rites of passage for going, young boys into manhood. Until recently, we had military. That was about it, right? Let alone the change of the female body when they start their moon cycle, right? Those are it. The only thing that we have is maybe Christmas or, Hanukkah or, whatever you celebrate. But in our society, there is really not much. Even death In Southern Europe, there is more around the ritual around death. You sit multiple days. There's a wake. In Holland, you get 2 hours off work, and then you sit in a circle with a piece of cake and a coffee, and then you go back to the office again, right? So in that sense, ritual is... The lack of ritual is really, I believe, part of the disease in our society, where we have the young who are the ones at the forefront of our society, and the lack of relationship to our elders. And ritual and these kind of rites of passages would create a balance between both. It's a balance of honoring that wisdom and being guided. And now we are in a state where this, teenage, like as a consciousness in the West, we're like in this teenage kind of, and we need to go through this initiation process to temper our ego of thinking we know it all. Like we started off this conversation about when we were in our teenage years, where we thought like, oh, I'm so grand, I'm so amazing, I know it all. That's part. So these rites of passages and ritual in that sense would create a community. And going back to what I also named is that in the ritual of that transition, the coming back would be for the service of the whole. And what we have right now is that a lot of course, the healing, and I've created a retreat platform, so I'm contributing to that as much as anybody, but I'm observing people come in for my healing, my transformation, my spiritual connection, my mystical experience, my default mode, my. And then go back home and maybe continue, take away 10%, some people 40%, maybe some are lucky with 70% and they are able to integrate it, what they learned, and actually change behaviors, right? But the purpose would be in the ideal world for me, and this is also what I've actually embedded in my programs, is that at the end of the retreat, at the end of the experience, what are you giving back? Who is this serving? Great that you are understanding your wounding, your trauma, your epigenetics, you're processing your grief. Great, you'll have some benefits of it. But then what are you going back into your community, in your family constellation, in your office? And how is that going to benefit it? So I just wanted to bring ritual more as the lack of rites of passage and the importance. So for me, it's like if we look at it that way, then we see that the small acts of ritual, which is maybe sitting at your altar or your nature table, if altar is not the word that you use, but you have a place of intentionality where you focus your attention. This is the place where I'm honoring my devotion, the sacred, the unseen, the great mystery, the sublime. This is where I do my work. This is where I place my letter that, for my inner child. This is where I light my candle to honor my gifts inside or the gifts of someone else. This is where I pray or set my intention. Those smaller personal acts contribute to an awareness of the importance that we're part of a bigger web, and makes us connect to this bigger web of knowing. Right? Ritual makes us connect and step out of the mundane and connect to the most important part, which is the third party. Let's say it's you, the altar, and the third party, which is the great mystery, God, the goddess, And what happens to our psyche? We go into a state of humility, into a state of faith, a state of trust, and a different state of awareness, where then possibility arises, where our mind can maybe find answers to complex questions in your life. So we have the meta ritual in our society, and we have the personal ritual, and both are very, very important. And how you do it I always say be playful. And that's another part of cultivating curiosity is, adults stop playing, be playful. There is no perfection in it. Do you sing a song, be weird, write a letter, light a candle, whatever your way is your way, the weirder, the nicer, as long as it makes you happy, because there isn't anything stronger than being in your own authentic expression of joy is the biggest protector energetically. Your expression of your authenticity. So don't copy Jason, don't copy me, do you. That's the biggest thing you can give, So I know it's a cliche, but I've seen the power of it in my own experiences with complex metaphysical situations.
Earlier you mentioned, and you mentioned again, this word sublime. It's interesting because often even this idea of the opposite of that, something like fear, usually the opposite of that is something like sublimity, awe, inspiration, and there's this polarity. And do you think that's also connected to this idea of the loss of initiation, the loss of ritual? Because it's something I often reflect about is we do seem to have moved very far from that. Most of us, we have a relative comfort, and it's very easy to find things to kind of assuage or to quell these deeper sensations, which can be fear, because fear is a gateway to awe. Even these rituals you mentioned, I mean, there very often was some aspect of death around that. I mean, even if it was the very act of a ritual around death, which we become, I think, very far removed from, or these initiatory experiences, traditionally, death could be very possible, prevalent in those. People didn't always return from these initiations, and they were often considered very difficult. It's what separated a boy from a man, or a young woman from a mother. Even the act of birth. I mean, it's something, interestingly, I just spoke about on, I think, the last podcast with my friend Marta, but this idea that in a way we really, I think, disempower women from this act of giving birth on their own, because there's something very initiatory about that, something that is a rite of passage, and that there's a great power that can be emerged when we go through that. And we obviously we want to create what we would call safe spaces, places where seemingly we emerge in a good way, and that's something that's I think very, very important and very valuable. But at the same time, like most things, if we go too far away from something primordial, where death is very close, we begin to lose this sense of awe, the sense of awe of life, as you said, this idea of a great mystery, of even the act of trying to understand everything. We begin to lose something. But this idea of the sublime, of the awe, I think there is something very fundamental, which also ties back to this thing at the beginning, which is this longing. Do you see these practices, whether it's working with plants or psychedelics or darkness, that those also begin to get us in touch with that? And again, this is going to be a big question, because it also ties into joy, which I think is something very, very simple. And yet I think a lot of people have a resistance to that idea that could that be the answer, is simply being happy, being an embodiment of joy. I think in so many of our cultures, we look at that as maybe being too simple. So I know that's kind of a big, maybe vague question, but just any thoughts that arose from that?
Yeah, there's a saying in Dutch: you can drop a kind of a penny in me, and I'll just go ramble. So it's fine. absolutely, there is. I've seen many people in ceremonial settings where joy showed up and they almost got really angry that joy showed up because it was like, no, it can't be that easy because I have been in this challenge for such a long time. This should also be challenging. What? It can be just that easy? It's my doing? It's what? It's me? So yes, absolutely, joy. And you said the word, it's too simple, and we look down on simple, you know? And this is the gift of my Portuguese upbringing where, just presence. My grandfather, after a day of work, was just present outside with a mosquito thing and hitting them. And that was his Zen practice. And I was sitting for hours like that, in the simplicity of it, right? And that slowness. But to speak into the theory of the sublime, there is an encounter that takes place, or an understanding that takes place, either be it maybe with nature or with art or expanded states, or maybe even with existential questions in a way, right? So there is a way that these encounters push you beyond the structures of our ego and invites us into kind of a sense of connection to the universe, right? Or the connection to something bigger. And because this isn't an intellectual exercise, it's visceral, it's transformative, there's an expansion of the soul. And in our world, in this kind of modern world, which I hate saying those words, but, we know at the moment I'm not finding another one, but in this modern world, there is an overpriced fixation on efficiency, strategy, over mystery. And this prevents us to actually connect to the sublime in its simplicity, and therefore we often overanalyze, explain, dissect the things, and the wonder almost slips away, And this is also where depth then slips away, because the loss of this goes beyond our personal disconnection. It actually, to me, it impacts a collective ability to dream, create, and then lead. So connecting to the sublime in that way can look like, I will give an example of my day-to-day life in Amsterdam on a bike. Anybody has known anything about Amsterdam, we bike a lot. And sometimes what happens is that there is a kind of a vibration in the city, especially at the end of the day when the golden hour, and then there is this breeze. And somewhere this breeze and certain birds, when I hear them, there is like my breath changes and I feel connected and I can just smile. And everything I observe while I'm biking through the city, there is a beauty to it, A kid, dropping something, two people holding hands, and in that simplicity, feeling the interconnectedness of life, and therefore this is also awe and wonder. Or maybe for you, it's at the beach, sitting at the beach and staring at the horizon, which is such a great thing to do because it's so vast and makes us feel the impermanence of life in that way. So those are the simple moments of awe and wonder that can cultivate like this sense of interconnectedness and this sense of longing and belonging. And now we're coming first circle to the beginning of our conversation about longing and purpose and meaning. And I believe connecting to the sublime in that way and the everyday life connects bigger to meaning and purpose. And of course, and psychedelics are like on steroids gateways to connect to the sublime. But and it helps us step away of the illusion of separation, right? in that sense. But then we want to bridge that to the everyday life. We're not going to be on plant medicines every single day for the rest of our lives, right? So it's simple a remembering, a re-entering of our relationship to it. So yeah, that's my little take on the theory of the sublime.
It's interesting you say birds. When growing up, I would take these trips with my father, and he was very interested in kind of traditional indigenous cultures around the world. And I always found it very fascinating, even as a child. Like there would be these bird watching, I don't know what you would call them, like events, and all these people, they had these really nice, beautiful cameras and all this equipment, and they would see a bird and they would capture it on the camera and they would name it, and then it was done. And as a child, it felt like there was this huge disconnect of like once you captured it, once you named it, then somehow you moved on to the next thing, and there was almost this like deep sadness of like they couldn't see it, they couldn't experience it because it was labeled. And for me, that was part of that idea of the disconnect to the awe, the sublime nature, that once you name it, once you give it form, once you just put it in a box, then it's dead in a way. It the mystery of it, because you could look at a bird for the rest of your life and notice infinite things about it. So yeah, it's interesting you use that analogy of the bird and what that can invoke. Interestingly, in many traditional cultures, they have a real reverence for birds because they view them as messengers of spirit. One of the interesting things you said earlier on, which I think is something that's often maybe spoken about, but often I think maybe in a more superficial way. And you said something very interesting, and maybe you can clarify, but you were speaking of this idea of hate and kind of seeing that we can have hate within us. And I think very often we can understand that maybe on an intellectual level, but it's also something I found very fascinating, and you can often see it in political discourse, is people will look at someone and hate them because they view that person as someone who hates. And so it's this fascinating thing that we can see it in someone else, but it can be very difficult to see that very same nature within ourselves. Do you find these practices that they can be mirrors in a way of that to begin to give us insight? Also, as you were saying, like people are very often searching for some sort of maybe peak experience or to experience loss of ego, beauty, union, rainbows and unicorns. But that sometimes, and even as you mentioned very interestingly, like sometimes even when someone finds something like joy, they can brush it aside because it seems like there should be something else. But often what maybe could be seen as shadow work or this deeper internal work, which again, I think sometimes can be lost because again, when we just label something as shadow work, we can somehow think we have an intellectual grasp of that. But on the deeper somatic level or the experiential level, the embodiment of it, we may not be embodying that. What do you think is that process of these tools, whether it's plants, fungi, anything that can begin to shed light on that? Because that does seem to be something that's very important. Because as you said, like, unless we're really in touch with that hate within ourselves, like so many of these things are programs that just continuously run in the background. Like we're speaking on a computer right now, and there's all sorts of like probably windows open and things at the top of the screen, little programs running in the background that we don't even really notice. They're just there, but to actually notice them is a huge thing. Do you find these to be powerful tools to be able to do that?
Yeah, and yes, and into that is friend of mine, Alexander Beiner, who wrote a book, not necessarily plugging his book for this case, but I always want to give credit when I'm using someone's words. He says about the shadow, the me that I cannot see. And a lot of, the work within expanded states is indeed reflective of the me that I cannot see. And the language of it or the flavor of it can come in so many different ways. Parts of in metaphorical way, in archetypical ways, symbolic ways that they can come in. And then, of course, what you're also referring to is the tendency of projection outwardly, the one thing that we can't access ourselves. This is also the reason why we love movies, right? We through watching a storyline, we suddenly have access to a certain kind of emotions. Movies and TV are a brilliant way to map out as a practice of what is maybe some unconscious thing that you really want, like that wants expression within you. And then there is also a understanding, or maybe a lack of understanding, that we have psychological clusters of archetypes within ourselves, and that they're therefore created through time, space, wounding, minor 10 times through protection mechanisms, lack of safety in our upbringing, maybe even collectively, right? We have collective archetypical shadow aspects. And that relationship to it, it's the amount of times where people project outwardly the polarity within themselves is so often. And, it's indeed with anger and rage and superiority, victimhood, all of these aspects, sadistic sadistic ways of thinking, being, or longing, or addiction patternings, all of these parts that we have also labeled with shame, become unaddressed, really the imbalance in our psyche and in our society. And in that way, the way our society is right now is very much unacknowledged of this aspect. There is this facade of perfectionism and way of being, and our branding. We have individual brandings right now. I contribute to that as well. I want to reach the people that feel called to work with me. I'll put myself out there, and I have creative expressions, and I like photography, and I write, and there's ways to it, but that is also part of structures that are normally really prone to receive projections from others and expectations and assumptions. And this is, to me, real wisdom in that sense. And this is also the way you relate in those expanded states, is do you have the capacity to kind of self-regulate, slow down, and ask an open-ended question instead of assuming something immediately by the demeanor of someone, or the interpretation of what you interpret about where someone is or isn't. I personally like that tension point, to be honest. I like finding ways to maybe poke and question, even in our ecosystem of a guide, should look a certain way versus another way, a guide, maybe if I want to be a credible guide, I should have beige clothes and soft lighting and walk barefoot. But I don't like that. That's not authentically Natasja. I have a fashion background. I like high heels. I will wear my high heels and have red lipstick, But that's a very interesting tension point when we're talking about shadow and projection and assumption and what we do with that. And I have seen the harm of not acknowledging yourself in that. And I've seen the harm within facilitation a lot, within leadership structures, within psychedelic spaces, unaddressed shadow as a collective. What happens in the long run? I've seen it, how it cultivates really harmful cult-like perspectives, right? And so my personal approach is to, again, have consistent curiosity. What is it doing? Why is it doing? And then be playful about it. And I will share a funny take on, because this is actually also with Alexander and Alexander Beiner, who I just mentioned. We used to run a retreat program together. And in the morning, really early, the first thing we would do is have a long walk and talk about our dreams. Because in our dreams, we sometimes could really see what is in the field unconsciously, which we haven't picked up on, and we would share it. And I will share a very personal note, but for the purpose of maybe sharing some playful curiosity around personal shadow work. I used to have, now I don't have it because I've been working a lot with it. I used to have quite a dream with this archetype of a cartel boss. And it used to show up in my dreams, and with certain messages and certain settings, and I would really understand what was going on in the field or my internal process within the field, right? And that will indicate how to navigate the ceremony or bring in some practice or work with it. So I was having a walk with Alexander here, and I was sharing this dream about my cartel boss, and he's like, you know what will be really fun for you to do? To maybe become more, to have build a relationship with this aspect within yourself, which is part of your shadow. Maybe you should dress up as this cartel boss, because that's, your way of expression is the way it's your jewelry, it's your clothing, it's a way. It's like, wow, that's a great idea. So I actually dressed up and I found the clothing of how this cartel boss always looks in my dream. And I was like, I'm going to walk around the city, not to enmesh with it or have it take over, but to actually have again, the word relational, a dialogue with it, instead of saying, you're here because you're one of my allies, and you show up when specific themes are showing up in service, but also in my personal life. So there is a purpose to you here. What can I learn? And that was such a fun thing to do. And I was like, wow, this is really, this is authentically me going back to the time I had an organization in the fashion industry. It's still I still love that, but, making it a purposeful and intentional and bridging that with everyday life in that sense. So, now, I'm not saying that, if you have rage, just go be rageful. And I'm not saying if you're sadistic tendency, just be sadistic. That's not it. Always, let's put a disclaimer in here to work with actually experienced people that know, about depth psychology or shadow work, or have a deeper understanding how that metaphors and things show up, and you feel you are in a state where you can receive reflection and forms of feedback around your patterning in that way. And then, parts of our shadow is a continuous work. It's sometimes it shows up, and a lot of healers have this one, the beautiful archetype of the savior, the rescuer, where then we feel that we are the very important aspect to do healing with people, and sometimes we take away the discernment of someone else by thinking that we know best, which is very much shadowy in that sense from our rescuer, healer aspect of this archetype. So, and it's understanding when you have those tendencies. The same thing goes when we have these tendencies, which are sometimes cultivated with amazing skill in service or in ceremony or in group settings, But in your personal life, they're not welcome. Your friends are, do not need your advice all the time about how to deal with some things. And sometimes that's really annoying. I've had friends reflect to me, it's like, yo, we're not in your circle, and that's really confrontational, and it's an automated muscle, right? It's the assumption, it's superiority sometimes that kicks in. And it's building a relationship with these aspects within your own psyche that also helps. And this is, to me, a very important thing about those who hold circle in any broader sense of, once you cultivate these aspects with these aspects of yourself, it is also a very powerful way to keep the space really protected and clean. Because you'll be able to map out and understand the internal language that takes place and how it impacts the field. Because you have that deep relationship to it, and different stages in life, different things will come up. But sometimes if we change the word shadow work to the me that I cannot see, it's not that scary anymore, and we all have existential fears, but just being human, it's I want to say almost natural to have them. If you don't have them, that would be more of a red flag to me than if you do.
Early in the podcast, you said that one of the things that maybe in that spirit of curiosity was this idea of addiction and addiction of members of your family. Obviously, there's been a lot of work, research, I think broader understanding now that some of these plants or medicines can be very beneficial in working with breaking addiction. Usually when people are referring to addiction, they're referring to some substance. So someone is addicted to alcohol or marijuana or cocaine, which is also interesting because those are all potentially could be seen as sacraments in and of themselves. And also this paradox that you're then working with another, what some people would refer to as a drug, to break an addictive pattern. How do you view that? How do you view even just those very basic labels, the differentiation between being addicted to something, using as something to break that addiction, and what does that process look like? Like how can that work?
Yeah. Oh, my table just went cuckoo. Well, let's first start with this idea that, in any form of, let's call addiction, there is a longing to connect to something bigger, right? The label addiction a lot of the times has the assumption of unholy or, let's discard it. That's a, junky behavior, but there is a really deep longing, and a lot of the people that have kind of opioid or alcohol addictions or sex addictions or, they're really sensitive individuals, really talented individuals. A lot of the times. A lot of the medicine carriers and practitioners and facilitators have a deep relationship with addiction themselves, right? So there is this tension point and this paradox of working with calling one thing drugs and then the other thing a healing plant, right? Like that there is this tension point, and it's the same tension point where it is almost like it's dismissed in a way, right? One is virtuous and the other one isn't. And now I'm going really into a very different direction, but to me, it's the way that I look at life and zoom out completely. The purpose or the life choices that are, maybe some of you believe in that or not, but to me, it's more coherent with my truth, is the choices we make before this human expression that we are in as souls. And the big cosmic order and divine plan who knows that they're doing a really big service for the growth of other souls in that way. And this is something that I've seen in the addictions, especially when it came to opioid addiction from a family member, is a very big aha moment happened in 2016, where I was personally in ceremony, and it suddenly clicked, where I went, wow, everything I've done wanting to learn, or what we shared about cultivating curiosity, what catapulted me on this path where I feel that I'm walking my purpose in a way, wouldn't have happened if this individual hadn't done what they had done. Because of that, I actually went on a quest, flourished, searched, and trained muscles that I probably wouldn't have had if that wouldn't been my fuel. And I felt so humbled of understanding and again, it's not dismissing the human experience and that pain. It's not about bypassing it. It's by having a perspective with it, right? There is still a challenge and a wounding and a trauma that happens in that relationship, not just blatantly accepting it, and now we bypass someone's choices and the impact that it has on a full family constellation, right? That's not it. But there was another perspective on a let's call it a meta way of looking at it. What if this? And that was part of this emerging of this inner knowing, what we spoke about earlier, this intuitive personal wisdom that came in. I was like, hey, so these are different perspectives on it. And then at the same time, what makes it, of course, any form of dependency. And I have seen so many guides, facilitators, so-called shamans being extremely addicted to their practice. From rapé to bufo to doing it every other day to DMT vaping, all of that. But, they're psychonauts. So it's the same, there is no difference in that. And then again, to me, the real wisdom is, how do you integrate? How do you take accountability for your behaviors that come in? You could have the shadow aspect of the plant and the flourishing aspect of the medicine of the plant. The plant can turn on you and can kick your, and be addictive, and the plant can be a blessing in your life. And this is part of our structure that we are in our existence here. In this, call the earth the living library, in this living library here together. So someone that is on crystal meth is not less than someone that calls himself a shaman or a healer that is taking bufo every time it administers to a client for healing, So why would that be? Why? So in that sense, I think it's relational. And then there is another aspect of it, what I feel there is a kind of, in the field, especially through the academic lens, a superiority around the aspect of the clinical academic approach, where there's an actual real lack of personal experience and relational respect to the unseen and the spirits of it and the knowledge and the indigenous knowledge of it. There is an arrogance in it, enmeshed into it, where there is a real big stance upon creating IPs on how to even administer it, and mindfolds and sound baths, and I don't know what kind of things people want to own in those kind of academic approaches. But the most important one is that it's looked upon down on the recreational aspect. So, the plants in itself and the fungi are not addictive in nature, is the way we have co-opted it that is addictive, right? It's the way we co-opted cigarettes instead of it being sacred, tobacco. That's the turn, that's the shadow that we're experiencing of that. So, but recreational is really looked down upon. And this, we go back to our comment around joy. Parts of what our society is missing, besides the rites of passage, is that all levels of society, rich, poor, and everything in between, come together in a celebratory way to celebrate the seasons, or, like looking at the Eleusinian mysteries, right? Where there is a sacrament that makes everybody equal for that day a year. And there is a rites of passage, and different gods or goddesses, call them archetypes, if we want to keep it a little bit more approachable, are celebrated, which are archetypes within ourselves and our human psyche. And I believe that we actually need, besides the importance of research, I don't want to dismiss that. I'm very, very grateful for it, for a lot of different reasons. But there is a lack of acknowledgement that creating circles with elders with more experience in a recreational, celebratory way of being with plants and together is also our need for shared humanity, our need to dance and play and laugh and express and be creative. And they are as much part of that celebration as they are part of the capacity to heal, which is such a small component, actually. If you really dive deep into learning from these allies, you understand that the healing aspect is an end result of a lot of other things. It's actually a dojo in training of your ego and metaphysical ways. It can be expressed and worked with in many different ways. So recreational sacred circles, and this is why I see kind of festivals where there is still a harm reduction being there, and where we have music, and whatever music someone likes is a way to come into recreational relationship with these medicines as well. And why is that less sacred than the intentional container of a 5-day retreat? Long as you know your risks, you're educated, you know your things. And by now, luckily, we live in a society where we know a lot. But I think we still have a lot to learn, to grow into. That in Sunday service could be a circle around the fire and dance with our elders. That's what I'm calling in. Maybe on some good deep house music and drumming.
A lot of your work, I think, focuses around this idea of facilitation. It's a word that many people, it's probably outside of their vernacular, obviously within these maybe circles. It's a word that's commonly used. Again, it can have many, many different meanings. What does that word mean to you? What is the role of a facilitator? Who is a facilitator? What is that role? How does someone do that well? And what are the pitfalls of that? Again, broad question, but just speaking more about that role.
Yeah, I think it relates also to the word space holding is also such a, I use that a lot for years already. And, it's also such for a lot of people, it's vague. It's like, what? I like personally the word facilitation a lot, because you are in a way in relationship to a process, and you're supporting the same as a guide, you're supporting the process. A facilitation could be, from a curtain circle to, guiding an expanded state. So it's broad. But you are in a process where you are taking for a moment the role of the co-regulator, right? It's not that you are here to solve everybody's problem. You're facilitating the journey inward, for the support of the journey inward for someone else. And the more you're able to influence the space with what you have done as inner work, which creates the co-regulation, the nervous system to nervous system regulation. And in that sense, the sense of connection and safety and trust in the ability of the individual that can go maybe into a deep transformational healing space, or a soft, exploration of an emotion, and everything in between. So facilitation in a way can be either a therapeutic setting, it can be, a celebratory setting, with sacred cacao and breathe and dance. You can be facilitating of both. So in that sense, it's quite broad. And, in ways of what I have seen over the years, where people get a bit maybe confused, is the assumption of what you have to do, bring, or create. And it always is quite tricky when it comes to facilitation in terms of people's healing journeys, when it's more deeper work in that sense. And this is where, there is a core principles that one should really look out for and to embody. And then from each of these principles, there is, we could go a whole podcast in there. But I will touch upon it lightly. First one would be, what I already said, the co-regulation, the somatic presence that someone has. You're regulating your own nervous system so others can feel safe and soften into. The other one would be the energetic hygiene, being what is clearly yours, what is not, what is unconscious, what is projection, what are you absorbing, what how are you influencing the space, energetics, the understanding and the acknowledgement. And this is where a lot of kind of training programs around expanded states, either breathwork or psychedelics, is untouched upon the acknowledgement of the energetics, right? It's either very academic, and how many doses is this effect, and how do I create a mystical experience so people have extremes, but understanding the importance of this energetics hygiene that comes in as well, which is knowing about everything we spoke about just in this podcast already, from shadow to relationship to the sublime. That is all part of the energetic hygiene, is what is your relationship to all of that in a way. And then this third one would be the magic word, relational attunement. You have an ability to listen beyond the words, track the emotional field, track the energetic field, track the physical field, the relational attunement to the actual physical realm, keeping that safe, and the spiritual realm. What is your understanding and relationship to both? And another one would be discernment. Discernment is so important, knowing when to intervene, when to hold, and when to step back. And that is a skill that I always say to groups that come in, I was like, well, you can read a great marketing text and a copy on my website, but what I actually do is I'm a cleaner. I'm basically a cleaner. My responsibility is to keep everything as clean as possible. Clean, and then you have the ability to almost like obsessive about micro expressions, right? Which is really discern what it is what the field needs beyond your own assumption of what may be taking place. And that is such an attunement. It's so fine. It's such a fine line in that. And then the integration mindset. Always holding the bigger arc of transformation, not just the peak moments. So when these principles are literally embodied, a facilitator becomes like an anchor for the room. And not by controlling a process, but by being steady, trustworthy, and people can feel really open and supported in that way. So So that's to me like the markers of that needs to take place. And integration, I want to share because it's such an important word, and it's also a little bit overused. The people use it a lot. But integration sometimes looks like you as a facilitator, guide, practitioner, healer, that you have the same kind of devotional aspects and relationship to what you would expect a participant or a client to have. That means, for example, my personal devotional practice is to study one medicine at a time, commit fully to that, and integrate that over a year without interfering anything else. So I shared already about darkness. I'm now in year 2, exploring darkness in many, many different ways, from 7 days is my max to 24 hours every month. I'm about to build my own container for 3 days all alone without any support. Like, be that your medicine and integrate, learn, journal what shows up. Really, integration as in do the one thing and do it well and take your time. My first vision of the tobacco spirit was 20 years ago, and I always was very impatient. I remember asking a teacher of mine, she's a grandmother medicine song from the Hopi Native American tradition. And I remember in one of the teachings, it's like, oh, I want to go into tobacco and have a sacred pipe. And that, like, okay, I'm going to ask permission and if your pipe can be made and all of that. And I was like a kid in a candy store. And it took me like many, many years before the spirit actually showed up in the way it needed to show up, with a dear sister who was trained in the Shipibo tradition. And, and I sat in ceremony with her and it all came in. I was like, wow, okay, I needed to really be patient. The teacher will only show up when the student is ready. You can't force that field. And it's that kind of relationship that I feel that we sometimes miss in the facilitator program services support, that there is maybe an ambition or a longing to connect to a specific practice or teaching or spirit, but there is a time and a place and a readiness for it, or maybe never. Maybe it will never show up for you, and maybe you're meant to be doing something completely different with it and taking that time. So I want the integration mindset to really observe that integration is not about you give your clients 5 journaling prompts about their process. Integration mindset is slow down, look at the bigger picture, commit to things over an extended amount of time, and wherever your ambition is taking over your patience, that's your work to do.
Yeah, beautiful. Kind of as we begin to wrap up, because I think we're coming to both our time limit. One of the things that I really appreciated that you spoke about from a few posts that I saw from you was this idea that we touched on in the beginning. I mentioned these pillars of the house, and one of those is that generative, creative aspect, which is also tying into money. And even if you take things from like a Christian worldview of humans are made in God's image and God is the creator, which isn't just a Christian worldview, you find that in almost every tradition, then that idea that one of, if not the highest gift that we have is this ability to create. And usually through that generative process, money is a form of exchange. It's something where we're being valued, where our creative energy that's bringing that, that unseen into something being made manifest. I mean, that very dualistic concept of taking spirit and bringing it into this world, creating, making it manifest, that there's value to that. And it's very interesting because usually in our Western societies, we've kind of lost maybe the equivalent of a facilitator, a shaman, a space holder, a guide. But we have things that could loosely be considered at least partial equivalents, like a medical doctor or a psychiatrist, psychologist. usually in our societies, those are very highly valued fields. They're usually very well paid. There's a lot of respect. There's a lot of honor to them. There seems to be a very common worldview or archetype that somehow in this work, whether it's plant medicine healing, facilitation, that it should just be done for the love of it, or somehow money makes it dirty, or it takes away from the healing aspect. Or in the same way of a teacher. Like most people, if you go to a teacher, you wouldn't expect the teacher to just freely give, although it could be, but almost always there's some form of reciprocity. And in fact, in many traditions around the world, it's seen that sickness actually arises from a lack of reciprocity that we're taking without giving back. And yet, it seems to be kind of a fairly prominent worldview that there shouldn't be a reciprocity in this way. And I think one of the things you touched about is that there's an importance and a value to valuing one's work. And obviously it's tricky because when one is a medical doctor, there's a very clear path. There's usually your salary is probably set by someone other than you. It's a much more straightforward, standardized, culturally accepted form. And I think a lot of people struggle who maybe enter this field. And as you said, there's this more archetypal yin, the accepting, the healing, the dance, the receptivity, but that may be more archetypal masculine energy, which is boundaries and labeling and containment and being very overt and clear that there is a reciprocity, that there is a form of payment, that's very, very important. And I think it's really important to give voice to that. And I think that's something to say and to name that I think you touched on very beautifully. Can you speak a bit about that? Because it's often like a very taboo subject. And I think something that in the end causes not only the practitioner pain, but interestingly, the client as well.
Yeah, 100%. And the amount of mentees and people that I supervise who are facilitators, counselors, therapists, guides, shamans, who have almost all of them, like really 95% of the people have a very distorted relationship to money and value. And there's a real conflict within it. It's really, really... It's really, it's so fascinating. Money and sacred work, it sits in this kind of a tender place because it touches upon, and I already said the word value, it touches upon devotion, it touches upon power, it touches upon exchange, and survival too. And these are often really old conditionings, right? So one perspective is that the money is the opposite of sacredness. Money is a form of relationship and an energy exchange that shapes the world that we live in. I already gave those two case studies, and that kind of relational space that we have to the business and structure is the same kind of thing with money. And the real question is less about should sacred work be paid, but more about what is the quality of the relationship around money here. Right? That is to me very, very fascinating that I love to explore in many different ways, because when money is denied, avoided, or made impure, sacred people that do sacred work often end up depleted, resentful, under-resourced, and unconsciously dependent on being needed. This is really what I see over and over and over that shows up. And then the quality of compassion fatigue shows up, which is a real happening when people that are, supporting others and, in services of others, So when money becomes an inflated or way with status, sacred work, and of course use its humility and start serving more around image or branding or power or extraction in a way. So the practice is not purity in this sense. The practice is the invitation of integrity and understanding how the the imbalance around that is taking place. A way that I like to work with practitioners around this is maybe asking the question of, what am I actually asking money to do for me? That could be that's a question that we often go into. Or where do service and self-abandonment get confused? That's another question. And what kind of support do I need to be sustainable in dignity and in clean relationship? So a lot of the times what we do first is be super practical about things. We go very practical. I'm currently working with someone who's really going into, serving groups, done a lot of training. Amazing work within trauma-informed work, amazing teachers in traditional sense, and sort of bridging both. And she has a real difficulty, and this is why we're working together, on what to ask people. Her teacher asks an X amount, and she's like, how do I ask? What can I do? I don't have that experience. How would I build up? And it's like, let's start from the base. Let's start by understanding, what are all your costs? And once she did that, and it's so simple, when she did that, she was like, oh, wow. Yeah, now I get it. And sometimes it starts off with making a very simple, let the mind start to understand. But from a psychological lens, often money activates, of course, ancestral material, a lot of the times, family constellation material, worth, visibility, also loyalty, guilt, maybe even class systems, even spiritual identity can touch upon this. So that's why I feel that this conversation around this and sacred work and money are rarely practical things. They're part of almost initiating the next stage of someone's evolution in their services. It always happens. In every single stage, this comes up, and you need other people around that can actually support you in going through that initiation process where this money and exchange of worth steps in. So from a more, let's call it a mystical lens in that sense, we can understand that we can see this as a steward for resource. If we start to name it like that, it's something else, right? So it's not about something that needs to be worshipped, money, not something that needs to be rejected, something to be placed in the right relationship. And in that sense, the question becomes more around, does the exchange create more coherence, responsibility, and reciprocity to everyone involved, right? So that sacred work doesn't become something less because it's paid. That to me is not coherent with it. And certain structures serve certain ways of doing in certain traditions in a very different cosmology, in a very different society structure. Right? We have a different structure nowadays than a lot of the original structures that are working in the healing fields, right? Where different types of exchange and different kinds of constellations were there and hierarchies were there. But it can definitely become super extorted and quite shadow when money is hidden, is avoided, especially when it's honest conversations are not have. So to me, the relationship between money and truth, in a way, money and reciprocity, money and a nervous system capacity, in a way, money and clean stewardship, this is where deep work normally begins. So yeah, it begins really to understand the first things I named is to really go deep into understanding these conditions as it is touches upon value, survival, what did I say, power, devotion, exchange. And if you start to understand what this energy of money touches upon and where it hooks into you, and where wounding is for you in that sense, it will help you along into maybe making your decisions how you want to go about, to ask for that exchange and what would feel wholesome to you in that way.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. As we begin to wrap up, what are you doing? What is your current work? Do you have anything coming up? How do people work with you? Maybe just if you can speak a little bit about what you're doing now and what that looks like if people are interested.
Yeah. Yes. So we're now in 2026 in March. So I don't know if someone listens to us in 2 years' time. Check the website. My personal website is natasjapelgrom.com. So that's just my name, which makes it fairly easy. That will guide you through all the different offerings and other platforms. But right now, in May and in fall, I have my 9-day practitioner immersive, really focused on people that want to deepen their skills in space holding. This is for people that are practitioners, leading facilitators, but also lifelong learners. I have a lot of people that are coming in that want to deepen their own work, sit with medicine, learn to sit with medicine, and learn how to support others, can catapult their own inner work in that sense. So that's definitely one. And then I work a lot with people in terms of mentorship in a cycle of 9 months. And then there are some people that come in with very clear supervision that already have an established service as practitioners and guides and facilitators who are seeing maybe gaps in certain aspects in a way. So that's my my online and in-person offering at the moment. And Eudaimonia Institute is my virtual platform where we're focusing also on leading facilitators and practitioners with supportive content and courses and master classes. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Well, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Natasja. I think I could talk to you for another 2 hours easy. There's still a bunch of questions I have in my head. So thank you very much. And the website, if anyone wants to get in touch, is the best place. Anything else? Instagram?
Instagram is also my name. You can find me, Natasja Pelgrom, my Dutch last name. My website is also the same name. So that's all very easy.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been beautiful. I think your wisdom and your experience really shines through. I feel like so much of what you say really resonates as truth from a lifelong practice and as you said, as we started, a deep curiosity, which I think is always the most beautiful place to start from. So thank you so much for your time, for who you are, for coming on and sharing. And I'm sure the audience is going to get a lot out of this.
Thank you so much for your invitation.
If you enjoyed my recent interview with Dr. Nathan Bryan and the health effects of nitric oxide and are curious to work with this very interesting molecule, as listeners of the show, you receive 10% off all orders from their website using the code UNIVERSE at checkout. I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Bryan and his holistic approach to health, which really emphasizes not adding on or doing more things, but first focusing on the unhealthy habits that limit our own endogenous production of nitric oxide. So focusing on that first and then working to add some supplementation. I think he's doing really good work and is very much in alignment with my own philosophy. So check them out, and I will put a link to their website and the discount code UNIVERSE in the show notes. All right, everyone, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. As I said in the intro, I think Natasja has a lot of wisdom to share and really speaking from a place of deep experiential knowledge, which I think is very relevant and also very rare in the time we live. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you're interested in working with myself, my colleague Marav Artsy, we have a number of retreats coming up. You can find all of that information on my website, nicotianarustica.org. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, as well as my personal work, remote work, consultation, integration work. If you are able to support this podcast, that's always a really big help. Patreon is an amazing website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month, become part of the community there. A lot of really interesting things that you can receive back, things like early access to shows. There's a lot of bonus material, Q&As. As always, thank you so much to the people supporting that way. And if you're able to, thank you so much in advance. And if not, as always, helping with the algorithms is a really big help as well. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the videos, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So that's it. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.